East Berlin, November 9, 1989. A government press conference is almost over. The room is filled with journalists. Cameras are running. Papers are scattered across a table. Günter Schabowski, a senior East German official, is reading through notes about new travel regulations that are supposed to calm a growing crisis. For months, East Germans have been demanding more freedom. Thousands have been leaving the country through neighboring states. Demonstrations are spreading. The government knows it has to do something. Then a journalist asks a simple question. When will these new travel rules take effect? Schabowski looks down at the paper in front of him. He hesitates. Then he gives an answer that will travel across Europe within minutes. As far as I know, immediately, without delay. Journalists look up. News agencies begin transmitting the statement. Television reports tell East Germans that the border is opening. Inside apartments across East Berlin, people turn away from their televisions and look at one another. Some grab coats, others call friends. Families walk out into the November night, and slowly, they begin moving toward the Berlin Wall. At the checkpoints, East German border guards know almost nothing about what has just been announced. They have not received clear instructions to open the border. They call their superiors. The superiors call other officials. No one seems willing to take responsibility. But outside, the crowds keep growing. Hundreds become thousands. People demand to be allowed through. The guards stare at the mass of citizens in front of them and wait for orders that never really come. Within hours, barriers begin opening. East Germans flood into West Berlin. Strangers embrace. People climb onto the wall. Champagne bottles appear. Hammers strike concrete. Television cameras capture one of the most famous nights of the 20th century. And because of what happened at that press conference, history is often told as if the Berlin Wall collapsed almost by accident. One badly communicated announcement, one confused answer, one enormous consequence. But there is a problem with that story. A single sentence should not have been enough to defeat one of the most heavily guarded borders in the world. For decades, the wall had survived protests, escape attempts, diplomatic pressure, and international condemnation. So why, on this particular night, did one confused announcement become impossible to reverse? Because by November 1989, the Berlin Wall was already being held up by a system that had been weakening for years. The concrete was still standing. The watchtowers were still standing. The guards were still standing. But many of the forces that had made the wall powerful were disappearing. And to understand why it opened so suddenly, we have to go back long before that November night. Back to the reason the wall had been built in the first place. After the Second World War, Germany was divided. In the West stood the Federal Republic of Germany, aligned with the United States and Western Europe. In the East stood the German Democratic Republic, backed by the Soviet Union. Berlin was also divided, even though the city itself lay deep inside East German territory. That created a problem for the East German government. Through Berlin, East Germans had a route into the West, and they were using it. During the 1950s and early 1960s, millions of people left East Germany. Many were young, many were skilled. Doctors, engineers, technicians, students, and professionals disappeared from the East German economy. For the government, this was not just an embarrassment. It was a threat to the survival of the state. So in August 1961, the border through Berlin was sealed. Roads were blocked. Barbed wire appeared. Concrete followed. Over time, the barrier became an enormous security system of walls, fences, watchtowers, patrol roads, lights, and armed guards. But concrete alone did not keep the Berlin Wall standing for nearly 3 decades. Behind it were 4 powerful supports: an economic system capable of sustaining the state, a government that people feared challenging, neighboring communist countries that prevented easy escape to the West, and above all, the Soviet Union, whose military and political power protected the entire Eastern Bloc. As long as those supports remained strong, the wall could survive. But by the 1980s, they were beginning to crack. East Germany had long tried to present itself as one of the most successful states in the communist world. Under Erich Honecker, the government promised citizens jobs, housing, education, social programs, and rising living standards. New apartment blocks appeared. Factories displayed production targets. Propaganda presented East Germany as modern, organized, and secure. And compared with some other Eastern Bloc countries, East Germany did have important industrial strengths. That is what makes its later crisis more interesting. The country did not collapse because absolutely nothing worked. It collapsed because maintaining the appearance of long-term stability became increasingly expensive. By the 1980s, parts of East German industry were aging. Productivity struggled to keep pace with the West. Modern technology was harder to obtain. Environmental damage was severe in industrial regions. The government continued subsidizing food, housing, transportation, and other essentials because raising prices risked public anger. At the same time, East Germany needed hard currency to buy important goods and technology from Western countries. Debt pressures increased. The state could still function, but the room for maneuver was shrinking. There was another problem that money could not solve. East Germans could see the other Germany. Western television reached many homes. People saw West German shops, cars, advertisements, and lifestyles. They compared what the government told them with what appeared every evening on television screens. The difference became increasingly difficult to explain away. Honecker's government kept insisting that socialism was advancing. But for many citizens, daily experience suggested something else. The wall was still strong, but the economic promise behind it was becoming harder to believe. Then, in 1985, something even more dangerous happened. A new leader took power in Moscow. Mikhail Gorbachev was younger than many of the aging leaders who governed Eastern Europe, and he understood that the Soviet Union itself was facing deep problems. His answer was reform. Perestroika promised economic restructuring. Glasnost encouraged greater openness. The reforms were limited, uncertain, and often contradictory. But their psychological effect across the communist world was enormous. If the Soviet Union itself admitted that change was necessary, what did that say about governments that refused to change at all? This question was particularly dangerous for East Germany. Honecker did not embrace Gorbachev's reforms. Instead, East German leadership remained rigid. Information coming from the Soviet Union could even be restricted when it became politically uncomfortable. The country whose political system had always looked to Moscow for legitimacy was now resisting the direction Moscow itself was moving. But Gorbachev represented an even deeper threat to the East German leadership. For decades, communist governments in Eastern Europe had lived under an important assumption. If political unrest became serious enough, the Soviet Union might intervene. That possibility had shaped the history of the Eastern Bloc. Soviet military power had helped crush challenges in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. Even when troops were not moving, the memory remained. People knew where ultimate power stood. By the late 1980s, Gorbachev was changing that calculation. He increasingly signaled that Eastern European countries would have to deal with their own political problems. Moscow was becoming less willing to use force simply to preserve unpopular governments. For leaders like Honecker, this was dangerous. East Germany still had an army. It still had police. It still had the Stasi. Soviet troops were still stationed on East German soil. But the leadership could no longer be completely certain that Moscow would rescue it from a political crisis. The wall's strongest support was beginning to weaken. Then came 1989, and events started moving faster. In Poland, the communist government had spent years struggling against the independent solidarity movement. After strikes, repression, negotiations, and growing economic problems, the government agreed to partially free elections in June 1989. The expectation was that the communist system would survive. Instead, Solidarity produced a stunning result. It won almost every freely contested seat available to it. The political message was impossible to ignore. A communist government had allowed even limited electoral competition, and voters had overwhelmingly rejected it. Then, in August, Tadeusz Mazowiecki became Poland's first non-communist prime minister of the post-war communist era, and Soviet tanks did not arrive. For people across Eastern Europe, That mattered as much as the election itself. Something that had once seemed impossible had happened. Communist political monopoly could bend, and Moscow might allow it. The Berlin Wall had not moved. But the world around it was changing. Then another country attacked the wall, without touching a single piece of concrete. Hungary. In May 1989, Hungary began dismantling sections of the barriers along its border with Austria. The physical Iron Curtain was being cut open. At first, this looked like a Hungarian story. It quickly became an East German one. East Germans were allowed to travel to fellow communist countries like Hungary. And suddenly, if Hungary's western border became easier to cross, East Germans had discovered a possible route into Austria, and then West Germany. They did not have to climb the Berlin Wall. They could go around it. During the summer, increasing numbers traveled south. Cars filled roads. Families waited near border regions. Some camped for days. Others looked desperately for opportunities to cross. Then, on August 19th, during an event later known as the Pan-European Picnic, a temporarily opened border near Austria became the scene of a mass escape. Hundreds of East Germans crossed into Austria. The significance was enormous. The East German government demanded action. But Hungary kept moving in the opposite direction. On September 11th, Hungary officially allowed East Germans to cross its western border. Tens of thousands eventually used the route. Now the wall faced a crisis it had never been designed to solve. The Berlin Wall could stop people in Berlin, but it could not easily stop another communist government hundreds of kilometers away from allowing East Germans into the West. A structure built to imprison movement was becoming strategically obsolete, and every person who escaped created pressure on those who remained behind. Why stay? Why accept restrictions that neighboring communist countries were abandoning? Why believe the government when the entire political map of Eastern Europe seemed to be changing? At the same time, the East German regime was losing credibility at home. In May 1989, local elections were held across the country. Officially, the results showed overwhelming support for the government-backed list. But opposition activists had begun doing something simple and extremely dangerous. They watched the counting. Citizens attended local vote counts, wrote down numbers, and compared what they had witnessed with the results later announced by the state. The numbers did not match. For years, many East Germans had assumed elections were manipulated. Now activists had evidence they could share. That changed something important. The issue was no longer only whether the government lied. It was whether ordinary citizens could expose the lie together. Church groups, peace activists, environmental organizations, and small opposition networks became increasingly important meeting points. Demonstrations began growing. And by the autumn, East Germany faced two different rebellions at the same time. One was made of people who wanted to leave. The other was made of people who wanted to stay and change the country. The first group was saying, in effect, "We want out." The second was increasingly saying, "We want a voice here." For the government, this was a nightmare. If it kept travel restricted, more people protested. If it allowed freer travel, even more citizens might leave. If it used force, it risked international condemnation and perhaps a crisis with Gorbachev. If it offered reforms, it admitted that the protesters had forced the state to retreat. Every solution created another problem. And then came Leipzig. For weeks, demonstrations had been growing around the city's Nikolaikirche, or St. Nicholas Church. People gathered after peace prayers and marched through the streets. The numbers increased. So did the government's fear. On October 7th, East Germany celebrated the 40th anniversary of its founding. Gorbachev visited. The leadership presented ceremonies, flags, and military displays. But outside the official celebration, protests continued. There was a growing sense that the government and its people were living in two different realities. 2 days later, on October 9th, Leipzig became the center of the crisis. Rumors spread that the government might finally use overwhelming force. Security forces were prepared. Hospitals were reportedly ready for casualties. The memory of China's Tiananmen Square crackdown only months earlier hung over the demonstrations. Nobody knew what would happen. People still came. Not hundreds, not a few thousand, around 70,000. They filled the streets carrying candles and chanting, "Wir sind das Volk." We are the people. The phrase was devastating in its simplicity. The East German government claimed to represent the people. Now the people were standing in the streets, telling the government exactly who they were. The authorities faced a choice: crush the march, or allow it. And they hesitated. No large-scale massacre came. The demonstrators moved through the city. They had challenged the state in enormous numbers, and survived. That moment changed the psychological balance of power. For decades, fear had flowed in one direction. Citizens feared the government. They feared the police. They feared the Stasi. They feared losing jobs, education, or freedom. But after Leipzig, something shifted. The state had also revealed fear. Fear of the crowd, fear of violence, fear of responsibility, fear of what Moscow might do, or refuse to do. The Berlin Wall was still physically intact on October 9th. But one of the invisible walls protecting the regime had collapsed. People now knew that mass protest was possible. The next demonstrations became larger. Less than 2 weeks later, Erich Honecker was gone. On October 18th, the man who had led East Germany for nearly 2 decades was removed and replaced by Egon Krenz. The government hoped a new face might calm the country. It did not. The crowds continued. People continued leaving. The leadership announced changes. Trust did not return. By early November, the East German government was trying to solve the travel crisis before it destroyed what remained of its authority. Officials began developing new regulations that would make foreign travel easier, but the process was confused. Rules were revised. Documents moved through the bureaucracy. The leadership needed a policy quickly. And that brings us back to November 9th, back to Günter Schabowski, back to the press conference. Schabowski had not been fully involved in every detail of the new travel regulations. Near the end of the briefing, he announced that citizens would be allowed to travel through border crossings under new rules. Then came the question, when does it begin? Schabowski looked through his papers and said the words that would become famous. As far as I know, immediately, without delay. What made those words so powerful was not that Schabowski had somehow destroyed East Germany in a sentence. It was that the government behind him was already improvising under enormous pressure. The state had created new travel rules because it could no longer control the crisis. And when those rules were badly communicated, there was no longer enough authority, confidence, or coordination left to easily correct the mistake. Television spread the announcement. People headed toward the checkpoints. At Bornholmer Strasse, the crowd became enormous. Border guards called for instructions. They were responsible for one of the most sensitive borders on Earth. But nobody above them seemed willing to give the order that mattered. Open? Close? Use force? Send people home? The crowd kept pushing forward. More citizens arrived because they had heard the border was open. The guards knew that trying to force thousands of people back could trigger chaos. Eventually, pressure became unbearable. The barrier was opened. People crossed. Then more crossed. The news spread. Other checkpoints followed. East Berliners poured into West Berlin. Some cried. Some laughed. People who had lived only a few kilometers apart but in different political worlds embraced. Cars sounded their horns. Crowds climbed onto the wall. Border guards who once represented the power of the East German state watched citizens dance above them. The concrete structure had not suddenly become weaker. The political system enforcing it had. That is the part of the Berlin Wall story that disappears when November 9 is treated as a lucky accident. The wall had been standing on 4 supports. The economy that helped sustain the regime had become increasingly strained. The Soviet Union under Gorbachev was no longer offering the same certainty of intervention. Hungary had opened an escape route through the Iron Curtain, and Leipzig had broken the government's monopoly on fear. By the time Schabowski gave his answer, almost everything that had made the wall enforceable had already been damaged. His mistake mattered. But it mattered because it arrived at exactly the moment when the East German state had lost the ability to control the consequences. The world remembers photographs of people standing on the wall, but the hidden beginning of its fall was not a hammer striking concrete. It was an aging economy, losing credibility. It was Gorbachev telling Eastern Europe, through words and actions, that Moscow was changing. It was Polish voters rejecting communist political control. It was Hungarian border guards cutting wire. It was East German families driving south because they had discovered the wall could be bypassed. It was citizens watching vote counts and proving their government was lying. It was candles in Leipzig. It was 70,000 people entering the streets and realizing that the security forces might not stop them. It was Honecker losing power. And finally, it was a government so overwhelmed that one confused sentence could send thousands toward a border its own guards no longer knew how to defend. There is one final detail that makes November 9 even more remarkable. While crowds were gathering at the Berlin Wall, the Soviet leadership had problems much closer to home. National movements were growing inside the Soviet Union itself. The Baltic republics were demanding greater sovereignty. Economic and political pressures were increasing. The system that had dominated Eastern Europe for decades was now struggling to hold together its own territory. So while television cameras showed one of the most powerful symbols of Soviet influence collapsing in Berlin, Moscow was already facing a larger question. Not whether East Germany could survive unchanged, but whether the Soviet Union itself could. Less than 2 years later, the Soviet Union would cease to exist. And that is why the fall of the Berlin Wall was both an ending and a warning. It ended one chapter of Europe's division, but it also revealed how far the collapse of the old order had already advanced. November 9, 1989, was the night the world could finally see it. But the fall had begun long before.